this year, and Todd Schulman at the Minneapolis Fed. So very broadly, what we're interested in here is the relationship between how people move across labor market states and the process of development. And the reason we're interested in this is because I think just sort of everybody's prior is that there are a lot of differences between labor markets across countries. There's smaller firms, there's more informality, people are holding multiple jobs, things like that. But in terms of systematic evidence, there's not very much out there. And the reason that's true, we think, is because number one, it requires comparable cross-country microdata across a sufficiently wide range of incomes to speak to these issues. And also, I think the tricky thing, especially thinking about labor market flows, is that you have to have some panel dimension to be able to speak to that. And so that's a lot of what we're going to do in this paper. So we're going to go out and we're going to try and collect as much data as we can in sort of large sample government-run labor force surveys. And we're going to come back with 13 countries across a bunch of different years, all of which have rotating panels. So if you want to think about this in just a few words, think of this as sort of like our attempt to do what IPUMS does, except with the CPS, essentially across countries. And so what we're going to do with that is we're going to create time series of quarterly transitions and hopefully give you some new facts. So we've only got 13 countries. We've got plenty of years, but they range quite a bit in terms of income, from a poor of Nicaragua around $4,000 up to the US and the UK. And when we put all this together, we're going to come back with a data set that's about 32 million people, or I should say observations, where an observation is a person that we can match for 2 consecutive quarters. And so we're going to take that data set, and what I'm mostly going to talk about today is just some facts on the relationship between how people flow across different employment states and the level of income in the country. I'll spend a little bit less time in the middle of the talk trying to interpret some of these facts through the lens of theory. And just to be upfront, maybe theory is even too strong a word. We're going to think about theories that are incredibly simple, and then towards the end, I'm going to talk about how you might take these simple theories and which ways you might want to extend them to be consistent with some of the other predictions that we're going to find in the data. So particularly, what are we going to find? So the aggregate fact here is that there's just way more churn in poor countries than in rich countries. We're going to look at exit rates from employment, job finding rates, job to job transition rates, and literally what I'm going to mean here whenever I say the word job to job is firm to firm. So I'll get into sort of what we can and can't say about that stuff in the middle. But all of these rates, when you look in the poorest countries that we have, so Nicaragua, think $4,000 to $6,000 GDP per capita, all of them are about 3 times higher than what we see in rich countries. What we're going to do with these aggregate facts is walk them through 2 separate but very simple models. And the reason we like these 2 different models is because they have different predictions of what turnover means for the economy. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to borrow some work from Menzio and Shi, where we're just going to say that what's going on in poor countries is that it's really hard to screen workers before you actually bring them into the firm. And then I'm going to show you a bunch of predictions from this very simple model that extend to more complicated versions of the model as well. But I'm going to show you a bunch of evidence on exit rates by job tenure. I'm going to show you that they converge across countries as tenure gets longer, exactly what we see in the model. And also I'm going to show you some sort of interesting, or at least what I think of as interesting evidence on the relationship between, what the returns to tenure look like across countries. And so relative to some of Todd and David's work, we're going to find something exactly opposite. We're going to find in poor countries, the returns to tenure in a firm are a lot higher than they are in rich countries. And that's also going to be something that comes out of this screening model. And so what we like about this is that sort of suggests that churn is not sort of a good thing. It's driven by some sort of inefficiency somewhere in poor countries, whether it be in the screening technology or some other distortion somewhere. Now, to sort of try and give churn a better chance, we're also going to think much more briefly about a job ladder model. Right? So maybe what's going on in this churn is that people are moving up job ladders quicker in poor countries or something like that. I'm going to show you that seems to be inconsistent with the data in the sense that what we find in poor countries is that high-wage workers are much more likely to move jobs than low-wage workers, which is exactly the opposite of what you would find if this is somehow people climbing job ladders. And so both of these models sort of speak to the fact that something is going wrong in some sense. And I'll try and be more specific about that but that this churn is not sort of like a good thing in the economy. And we'll have some more direct evidence as well that I'll talk about if I have time. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Will you be taking into account self-employment?
Yep, I'll go into all of that. Yep, let me put this last one up. So these models are they're specifically sort of as bland as possible. So the last part of what we're going to do is we're going to dig into a lot of the heterogeneity we have and say, all right, well, how would you want to extend these models to be consistent with sort of some of the other predictions of like what are the factors that are driving these aggregate results? So what things would you want to put together? And to your point, the things that are going to really come up as important are sort of like informality, and I'll talk about self-employment in relation to that. But the key thing that's really going to drive a lot of this action is the firm size distribution. And I'll be specific. Some of the things that don't seem to matter that maybe a priori you might think do matter. Sectoral composition doesn't seem to matter very much. And demographics, age and gender play almost no role. Education plays a little bit of a role. There are some more questions.
The reason I ask is that it's very hard to think about churning in the context of self-employment. And if the majority of the workers, say up to 8% in Nicaragua.
It's not that high, but go ahead. But, okay.
Then what does it mean that you
I'll define everything. Let me get through, we're going to get into all of that, I promise. But I mean, I'm going to be able to talk about churn and self-employment. I'm going to define churn in particular ways, just like we would do in, say, the US. It's just how the BLS does it. And then self-employment is in there. So I'm going to be able to speak to flows between, say, wage work and self-employment in poor countries and think about things like subsistence entrepreneurship. And in a subset of these countries, I can actually look at the wage somebody had at quarter T, and then look at their profits per hour in quarter T plus 1, and I can show you all sorts of things that speak exactly to that. Anyone else?
I wanted to say, what's the different size of firms? Is it 3 times higher? More?
That's a good question. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's quite a bit different. So,
let's say 8 times higher.
Sure.
Then isn't the job-to-job identical?
Isn't the job-to-job identical? What do you mean?
I mean, if the firm is 3 times higher, 3 times larger in rich country,
Yeah.
can we change in job-to-job at exactly the same rate, and your data will show up as 3 times more churn?
So in the big country, they change within the firm. You don't.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. So that's it. I'm going to talk about that. So think of the data we have as essentially the CPS, and then think of all of the things you can't do in the CPS. We're not going to be able to do a lot of those things either. So there are things like I know I'll get to this in a second, but we know their occupation. I know how long they've been in the firm. So I know if they change occupation within the firm. I don't know, for example, if say there's 10 accountants and I go from the bottom accountant to the next level up of accountant. That I'm not going to be able to speak to. But I'll show you some of the things we thought about sort of related to that issue, which is movements within the firm, which we think are probably important. And that'll come out. I'll mention that in a few slides.
So what if they are going through a structural change?
Sorry?
Structural change.
I'll show you sectoral composition seems to not be particularly important here, which I sort of thought it would be more important, but the data is what the data is. All right, so just very briefly, I'll go through some very quick stuff on constructing the data and then go through the facts, talk a little bit about the models, and then go through some accounting at the end. All right, so we went out trying to find every country we could that had rotating panels. We came back with 13, which was a bit less than we expected. But the key thing here is that they're surveyed for n quarters in a row, and then they exit the survey. But we need to be able to match people across quarters, which means that some countries that you might think of, like Canada, for example, has this rotating panel structure, but they won't give you the identifiers with them. We just found out yesterday that they will give them to you if you give them $10,000. Typical Canadians. And then the EU is the same way. They also have this structure in the LFS, but they won't give you the identifiers, or they won't give me the identifiers to be specific. And then we're going to do exactly what people do in the CPS.
Anybody can get the panel part of the European labor force survey.
So at the individual level?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that was not what they told me. Yeah, they told me they'd give me the repeated cross-section, but they wouldn't give me the identifiers to link across quarters. But I'd be thrilled if we could get our hands on that, because one of the things you'll see is that like the problem is that we're missing rich countries. It's not that we're missing poor countries. It's that once you start cutting the data in a lot of ways, you're
I can give you the one for Spain tomorrow.
That would be fantastic. This presentation's already paying dividends. Yeah, I mean, in percentage terms, this is fantastic. Yeah, so then we're going to go through and do everything they do in the CPS to clean this up that I won't bore you with. All right, so just to give you a sense, I'm not going to use all of this today, but this is the set of information that we've harmonized across these different surveys. So we've got everything related to employment. We can do hours, earnings, and wages. We're going to use job tenure quite a bit today. We also have contract type, which we're not quite using yet. Like, so I know who's on a seasonal contract, which you might think is important in poor countries. I can deal with formality, the rest of the stuff, establishment size, or the size of your own business. Industry and occupation are the hardest ones to code because countries change their definitions all the time. And so these are going to end up being mapped to what IPOMS uses, including all of the definitional changes. Now, I'm going to show you at some point that like industry doesn't seem to matter very much. The caveat to all of this is that we're looking at sort of very coarse bins of what an industry and an occupation is. So we're only looking at like 12 or 13 sectors and occupations. So in principle, a more detailed decomposition of this might provide better evidence, but at least to what we can harmonize across countries, they don't seem to matter.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about contract type, are you going to have information about the level of labor market regulation?
No, so we'll do that at some point, but it's sort of where we are now. We specifically wanted to stay away from that. So sort of what we have in mind here is that like what you see in a lot of the macro labor literature is these US versus Europe comparisons where these things matter quite a bit. These, labor regulations matter quite a bit. Our goal is to sort of say something a little different, which is let's forget about the direct labor market regulations and just try and say something about what happens between rich and poor. And then,
Because what I had in mind is like when you think about size-dependent type of regulation, like foreign cost in Italy or things like that, so that if you get reached to a certain size, you're very high.
Yeah, exactly, right. So that's sort of like the last part of this is going to show. I'll show you that firms, or I should be when I say firm here, I mean establishment. Establishment size matters quite a bit, and then we're not going to speak in this paper to why the firm size is different. What we'd like to just say is like if you're thinking about firm sizes, you might also want to think about how this also has perhaps amplification effects through the labor market or something like that. All right.
Could it be in the fact that firms close, open?
Yeah, so this is sort of my early, sorry, just to be fair, this is not true anymore. That bullet point shouldn't be there. We've done both of those. So this is what I was saying earlier. There's a couple things that you can't get out of labor force surveys. That's sort of the critical one. Like I'm not going to be able to tell you whether somebody moved from employment to unemployment because the firm closed or because their uncle got sick and they had to go live with him and couldn't work anymore.
We should have disaggregated statistics across countries, no?
Yeah, so we could. That's something we could do. We could just line it up with firm exit rates on the x-axis instead of GDP per capita or something and see. I don't know what the correlations of those things might be pretty close to 1, so I'm not sure exactly we'd be able to get much information, but maybe not. I don't know.
But do you have information that if a person is being on a mass layoff?
That's a good point. We do know like layoffs. I don't know if we'd be able to know like. I doubt it. We know layoffs and we sort of know what people's expectations are about when they might return from a layoff. I don't know if we'd be able to get information on like, did you get laid off with everyone else you work with or not? That I'm not sure. Yeah, but we could look. There's a lot of strange qualitative questions in a lot of these that speak to sort of some of that stuff. But yeah, that's a good question. All right, so here's what it looks like. Here's the real GDP per capita range over the years for the countries. List of countries in alphabetical order. Number of observations, where again an observation is somebody we've matched for 2 consecutive quarters. There's a couple things to point out. Number one, like there's no super poor countries here because these are expensive surveys to run. You have to run them every quarter and you have to find people for 2 consecutive quarters, which is non-trivial. And the other thing to note is that it's mostly Western Hemisphere countries. From some conversations with people in DC, this is apparently a function of the Inter-American Development Bank making a big push for these countries to run labor force surveys. So the third thing to note is that where we're constrained in a lot of this is sort of on the rich country side. And that's especially going to bite when we start thinking about things like job tenure, because for example, the US doesn't do a very good job of talking about job tenure outside of like the exiting, what do they call it, the outgoing rotation groups. So if we need, things like, there'll be some problems when we have to start dropping the US, and then we're basically left with the UK as our one very rich country.
From the US job to job rates?
Yeah, so we don't. That's exactly where we're going to have to start dropping the US. So certainly not back to 79. Todd tells me once you get to 94, they sort of ask people whether they're in the same job or not. But we actually just found that out, so we're not. We're going to have to drop the US when we think about job-to-job transitions. All right, so let's get into some facts. All right, so just to define these things, a person who is employed worked in the reference week, or they're self-employed, or they worked at least 15 hours as an unpaid family worker, or you're temporarily absent from a job with a defined return period. We tried to hold this as close to what the BLS does as possible. So self-employed people are going to show up as employed, and then we can break that out, no problem, and look at flows between workers and the self-employed. Unemployed is sort of standard, and then the leftover people are not in the labor force. All right. Last thing, I'm just going to show you a bunch of plots instead of like big regression tables and such things. So every plot here is going to be a country year, where we just aggregate things within a country year and then merge it together with Penn World Tables. All right, so here's just a couple pictures. These are flows from employment to non-employment, so either unemployed or not in the labor force. The blue circles are our microdata. The orange diamonds here are the aggregate EU data that they put out, just to show that it doesn't seem like our data is somehow wildly different from what you might expect from the aggregate data. And what you can see here is that exit rates are down around 3-4% in rich countries, up to around 15% or so in the poorest countries that we have, 10-15%. So maybe a factor of 2 to 3. You see a little bit difference in the levels when you look at flows from non-employment to employment. This right here is Palestine. So this is sort of like I don't know, maybe it's even like a sanity check on the whole thing. People in Palestine lose jobs exactly how you would expect given their income levels. Nobody ever finds another job, and they have extremely high unemployment rates as a response to that. But anyway, so these are sort of the aggregate facts. You can do this with fixed effects, so maybe if you think that it's coming from some country-specific factor, that doesn't seem to be driving things. You get very similar results when you add them in, at least for the exit rate. The job finding rate changes quite a bit once you add in the country fixed effects. It's still negative, it's still statistically significant. You can also put in time effects. Those seem to matter a bit. But either way, the result seems robust. It does seem like there's this relationship between income and entry and exit rates. Now, when you break this down a little bit, these are flows from employment only to unemployment. And the thing that pops out here is that there doesn't seem to be this relationship anymore. When you look at flows into people searching for work, that seems to be about the same across countries. You probably can't really tell it from here, but this line flattens out as well. So what seems to be different in the aggregate facts across countries is that there's huge variation in people like both exiting to non-employment and finding jobs from non-employment. And so this, is sort of, I don't know, we sort of expected this, but what's going on? Well, it's just that people from non-employment are way more likely to find jobs in poor countries than in rich countries. So this is the relative job finding rate from unemployment divided by from non-employment. So a low number here just means that you're more likely in a relative sense.
Yeah. In the developing countries, one thing I'm concerned concern about this employment in the informal sector and how that's counted, because initially they would be non-employed. They would be in it, for example, in Italy, not developing country, but we all are, informal sector.
Sure.
So how does this?
So this is a worker survey, right? So these they're counted in the survey, and they're counted as employed as long as they're earning income, just any money. It doesn't have to be, say, we're not looking at like tax records or something like that. So in principle, they're counted, and I don't think I won't show you this, but it's exactly what you'd expect. It's much higher in poor countries than it is in rich countries. I'll show you the decomposition. Interestingly enough, it's true that informal jobs tend to like turn over more often, but the difference, I mean, in poor countries, it turns out formal jobs are also really likely to turn over all the time. Exactly, yeah. Right, so people, they're much more likely to, in poor countries, to move from not searching, not attached to the labor market relative to rich countries. And the reason, this is one of these qualitative questions I was mentioning, when we look at people who we'll call marginally attached, these are people who want to work but for some reason don't search. There's way more of these people in poor countries, and they're also much more likely to move back into employment. So for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to call these things U plus N is just not employed, and I'm going to think about flows between employment and sort of not employment, because we don't seem to see very much useful distinction between these things in poor countries. Okay, now you can do something similar for job-to-job flows, and just again to emphasize, we're talking about flows between firms here. It doesn't look quite as nice. We also have to drop the US. We can add some of those back in. We just haven't quite yet. But you get all of the same results. It's negatively sloped, although, like I said, it doesn't look quite as nice. It's robust to including all the fixed effects you want and things like that as well. So that's sort of the result. That there just seems to be a lot more churn in poor countries. That's sort of the aggregate fact. And so what we want to think about now is two different models to just, in sort of like a very high-level sense, think about how we should interpret those facts. So the first model I'm going to spend a little bit of time on is a model in which workers and vacancies don't know true match quality. And what's going to be key and what we're going to assume differs across countries is that they only observe a noisy signal of it, and that signal is going to be less precise in poor countries. And so it's going to be harder to screen people. Why that's true, we're not going to take a stand on.
But if you do that, does the theory say that firms will be of different size? They can be different size?
Yeah, so, right, so, so this is sort of what I was trying to start with, which is here, obviously, there's not going to be a notion of firm size, because we're just going to have sort of vacancies in workers, or filled vacancies in workers. In principle, what you would want to do is think, what I'll show you at the end is that firm size seems to predict is the wrong word, account for a lot of this. And so in principle, what you'd want to do is think about like the relationship between, if you believe that this is sort of the key, this is some approximation of the right model, you'd sort of want to think about what the relationship is between firm size and your ability to screen workers and how that sort of evolves endogenously with it. We're not going to have a theory of that here, but yeah.
But to this point, so if you're going to have a job ladder model, you can't really get a job ladder in a very small firm. So
exactly. No. We can't really get it. Right. So yeah. Right. So we've looked at, say, yes. The short answer is yes. What's not going on is that what's not happening is that in rich countries, people are moving occupations within the firm a lot more than they are in poor countries. That said, these are sort of like aggregated occupations. So in principle, there could be a lot of movement within the occupation that would be exactly consistent with a job ladder. So we have to do more work on this, sort of tracing out like within firm wage growth relative to what happens to wage growth when you move across firms. We're not going to dig too deep into the wages today other than one point, which is just a function of the fact that we just finished most of this yesterday. So I totally take that point, and I think that's exactly sort of the right thing to be thinking about here. So what I'll show you in this simple signaling model, or not signaling model, but experience versus inspection goods model, is that the data is consistent with what it predicts about the tenure wage profile and tenure exit hazards. And then we'll talk about one slide on a job ladder in the simplest possible way, and show you that higher wage people are more likely to move. And that seems inconsistent with again, this very simple idea of a job ladder model. All right, so just to lay this out briefly. So think about a world in which there's some match-specific productivity between a worker and a vacancy, and that thing is log normally distributed. What we're going to assume is that workers and firms observe some noisy signal of match quality Y0, where what's going to differ across countries is the precision of that signal. You can do a little bit of algebra, and it turns out it's not that hard to sort of get a lot of this in closed form. And so what we're going to have here is that there's going to be some joint reservation wage of the worker and the vacancy, and then you can compute what the distribution of matches are that get formed, where you should think of A here as sort of like the length of the match. Now, they're going to form some matches. Some of them are going to get destroyed exogenously. But then also, each period, everybody learns the true match quality with some probability lambda. And so then some of those jobs are going to get destroyed. Jobs that you thought were pretty good, or matches that you thought were good, you're going to realize the true value of them. It turns out they're not going to be very good, and you're going to get rid of those workers. Or you're going to split, because also it could fall below the worker's reservation value.
Okay, so how does it work? So it's like they don't know the right variance? Is that what you're saying?
No, so they know the distribution of the possible realizations of the match quality, but then they get some signal of it, and then they update their beliefs, about what the true quality is. But then there's no information revealed again until, with some probability lambda, you've been producing together, nobody sees the output in some, then you're producing together, and then in period 10, you get the lambda shock, and now we all know exactly what x is.
But the difference is that the mean of y, is that x or mu x?
Sorry, where are you pointing?
Y0. What's the mean?
Yeah, sorry. It's got the same mean as the.
So then you learn nothing. So either you learn x, either you observe y0 and the mean is x, in which case you're learning something, or the mean is mu x, in which case you learn nothing.
Sorry. Thank you. You're right. Sorry, this should be an x. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Got it. This would be an even more trivial model in that case. All right. Does that make sense? Okay. Good. Thanks. Right. So. The only thing we want to point out here is that this precision is going to be pretty important, as you might expect, right? So this is what Menzio and Shi would call these inspection versus experience goods. So what's going on? If there's perfect precision about the signal, so the signal just gives you the true value, then you inspect all of your workers before you bring them into the firm, and so you know exactly the match quality. Whereas if there's no precision, then what you need to do is you need to experience these workers, right? You need to bring them into the firm, and then you learn about them through the production process. Now, what's nice about this structure is that it tells you exactly what the exit rate should be. In, say, rich countries, you should get sort of like a constant low exit rate. Whereas in poorer countries, you should get that same exogenous exit rate plus something that's declining over the length of the time you're working together, on average, right? These are average rates. The reason is, I suppose, kind of obvious, which is that, if you've remained in the firm for a super long time, chances are you're pretty good, right? Chances are your quality is above the reservation value. Otherwise, you would have discarded that. That match would have been discarded already when you get out. Yeah.
I guess the story doesn't seem to work. What? So you're saying if you're showing peanuts, you really just have to see this fact that you're showing peanuts before we know whether they're good. Whether if it's an assistant professor, though, we just glance at their CV, we know whether they're going to make tenure. It just seems like it's exactly the opposite. If you're doing very simple tasks, it seems like we can very quickly tell whether they're doing a good job or not. If They're doing something very complicated. Output's not easily observable. You work years on a paper, finally you realize it's not so good. You have to learn about this.
So it sounds like, so I'm going to give you two answers. Number one, there's a lot of microevidence that suggests the story you're telling is not true. That there are huge gains to like providing better information about workers to firms in poor countries. So Vittorio Bassi, who's right down the road from you.
Even more than in rich countries.
Even more than in rich countries, that's right. I mean, I should be a little careful there, right? Now we're comparing estimates across papers and such things, but yes. The second thing is, I want to be a little careful with that story because your story, the way you just pitched that story sounds a lot sort of more about like the skill intensity of the job or something like
Well,
that.
that's behind it. You're much likely to have a road task in a poor country that you want to hire a worker to do.
Yeah.
So you're much likely to have some cognitive task where there is an output observed regularly.
Yeah,
It's
and
hard to learn about quality.
I'm sympathetic to these stories. So what I'll show you at the end is sort of that like occupation is not sort of like a great predictor of this relationship. And so then you either have to tell me a story about maybe it's like within, you need like a better decomposition of what an occupation is or a narrower view of what an occupation is, or it's got to be something that works through some other channel.
You said you had crude industry. What level of
So industry makes no difference whatsoever. So we have like 13 industries, and then occupation, so occupation's like the same way. This is like exactly what IPUMS does. I think it's like 12. So I'm sort of sympathetic to this. I'm going to show you some results that I think, I mean, they don't prove that this model is true or anything, but I don't think they come out of like a ton of models, though I'm going to caveat that with saying we haven't worked through all the models yet or anything. Yeah.
Poor rich countries are equally good in learning the match quality, but the variance of the shocks to output in poor countries is higher. That would take. It does take more time.
I think that would. I think that would be okay. I think that would be okay. I'm not sure that. Yeah, my guess is that maps into this somehow in a way that I'm pretty confident is true. Let's say.
There is a big literature.
Sure. Yeah. No. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. So I agree, and I'll just reemphasize. I don't think you want to take this model in some super serious way. It's just sort of like those are the kinds of ideas we sort of want to push, which is like, it's something about your ability to properly screen. Where that comes from, we've sort of built it into this screening technology. It might come from how the distribution of possible output, realization, anything like that. Totally agree. Yeah. All right, so let me just give you a couple testable predictions in my answer to David. These aren't perfect, but I'm not entirely sure that these come out of a lot of different models. One is that the exit rates with tenure should have this big steep decline in poor countries. Because like to David's point, where are you going to learn the most information? You're going to learn it right away because that's when your distribution of workers is the worst, right? So you learn a bunch right away, and then you learn less and less over time in poor countries. So you should get this big decline that's sort of, this like convex shape. Whereas in rich countries, you'd have something that looks relatively flat. Like you're just not learning a lot about workers. And you put these together, and what you get is that these tenure exit hazards should converge across countries as tenure gets higher. So that's the first thing I'll show you. The second thing I'll show you is that tenure wage growth should be higher in poor countries. So in the rich countries, all the selection occurs before hiring, so wages are high, but they're also flat. Whereas on average in poor countries, all this selection is happening on the job. So the converse of this is that you're going to have low initial levels of wages that then grow quite a bit with tenure in the firm as you're learning about your workforce. And so here's the first prediction. These are tenure exit rates, or hazard rates, I guess. Once you get out into the tails of firm tenure, they all sort of converge together. Where you see the dispersion is in these like low tenure years. Right? And the lowest two here are exactly the two that we can actually look at, which are the US, or sorry, the two rich countries, which are the US and the UK. There's some variance up here in terms of the other countries, but this is roughly what you'd expect. And you can do this a bunch of different ways, sort of like plotting these these bars again, or these numbers against GDP per capita, and you get exactly what that first prediction is.
So you're saying even within occupations, you see this?
Even within, I'm not exactly ready to say that yet. We haven't done exactly that, but we should. If we do the same, we should do the same thing within occupation. We have done it within firm size, and you see the same thing. So to the extent that that's somehow correlated, but education? Yeah. So no, we haven't done it with education. I'll show you though. The education. I don't know. I guess this goes back to the comment in one of the earlier talks. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean,
and then to the extent that in countries with development, there are fewer schools.
So yeah, I'll show you that. I'm hesitant to call things big or small. If I rank all of the things that seem to be driving these results, education is towards the bottom. It's just that the variation in these rates are so large, and it's true that like lower educated people are more likely to turn over, but the gaps between them they're just not big enough to generate a lot of the action here. But yeah, all right. So that's the first prediction. The second one, oh sorry, yeah. Yeah, good point. This does not include the self-employed. You can include them and it looks the same. If I have time at the end or during lunch or something, I'm happy to sort of talk through how these things vary depending on. Yeah, it's a little tricky. So we have, for most of these countries, we have profit per hour for the self-employed. I guess if I want to take the data seriously, I should be comparing this to wages. I'm a little hesitant to do that. I'm not super confident on how people measure profits when they self-report their own profits in a labor force survey. But
Is the fraction of self-employed vary substantially across the different countries?
yeah, it does for sure. Yeah, it goes to a high of about 50%. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. No, certainly. Yeah, for sure. And I'll talk through that in a few slides.
Kevin. Yeah. So this here is where labor market regulations may be very important, because actually tenure may be determined by regulations that give more benefits if employees are hired beyond a certain number of months or years. So it would not be very surprising that you have countries that are heavily regulated in labor markets like Peru or Costa Rica there, or Brazil, having high exit rates at very low tenures.
Fair enough. Fair enough. If I remember correctly, though, like Brazil also has incredibly restrictive labor laws. Yes, I take this point. The question would be sort of like how much does it vary between Costa Rica, Brazil, Peru, and that? But I agree.
Maybe the fact that it looks similar with self-employed doesn't sound like a story or something.
I don't. So that's why it's not in here. I don't think it is the same story.
Oh, I thought you just said that.
No, the graph looks the same, but I think it's probably for very different reasons, right? I mean, like, who are the people who have 20 years of self-employment? These are people who are like,
yeah, you run your business.
You're a businessman, you know.
Saying it's not like you decide to go into a business and early on you don't know your
exactly. That's why it's not in this. That's why it's not in this picture, because I don't find it particularly convincing or reasonable to put it in this picture. Yeah. All right. So let me show you the second one. This I found a little bit more surprising, I guess. We're going to do something to David and Todd's earlier work, but we're going to put in like bins for how long you've been in the firm, and just run the same regressions that they did. And so here's what it looks like. These are, I guess, a little hard to see. This is the percentage gains from being in a firm for between 12 and 23 months relative to being in the firm for less than a year. And this is the same thing, 2 to 4 years of tenure, the percentage gains relative to being in the firm for less than a year. And you can do this a million different ways and you get the same results. And what you see here is this negative relationship between the returns to being in the same firm and GDP per capita. And so this is sort of another prediction that comes out of the model, which is that on average, there should be these big returns because the initial levels are so low and you're learning over time. Now, just to show you that this doesn't seem to just be some data artifact of using labor force surveys instead of, say, census data. This is just the replication of David and Todd's and others' earlier work, where you still see this higher return in rich countries to potential experience, so age minus education kind of stuff. So you still get this. It's just that when you look at firm tenure instead of potential experience, it flips, as the model would tell you it should. Okay, so that's one model that sort of suggests that, I'm going to call it inability to screen workers. We've already come up with some other rationales for why, other than just sort of the technology itself. That sort of suggests that there's some bad technology, some low productivity technology, or some distortion somewhere, maybe it'd be labor markets or something like that, that's not working very well in poor countries. So churn is not sort of like evidence of good labor markets. So the second one, I'm just going to go through this very quickly. Is it consistent with the job ladder model? We're thinking here is just sort of a world in which, you get wage draws. You just get like exogenous wage draws, and you take ones that are better, and you start moving up. There's been some earlier work that looks at this in rich countries, and in fact, what you see in the data is that low wage workers are more likely to change firms in these 5 countries, right? Which is sort of what you would expect. Now, if we do that in our data, we get something that looks a little bit different. So what I'm plotting here is the likelihood of moving to a new firm from the top 20% of the wage distribution relative to the bottom 20% of the wage distribution. And what you would expect from these very simple job ladder models is something below 1. Right? And so this is the UK here. There's a couple outlier points there that I'm not exactly sure what's going on. But number one, in the UK, it's below 1, as other people have found. When you get into poor countries, it's quite a bit above 1. So people from high wage workers are more likely to move to a new firm than low wage workers. You can look at the slope of this thing too if you want. It turns out it's statistically significant and negatively related to GDP per capita, regardless of whether you build in country, year, fixed effects, all that stuff.
Where did you take that individual?
Sorry?
Did you take that person?
No, in fact, we can't, because we only observe the one transition. Right, so, yeah. There would be no way we could do that. I guess we could condition on characteristics.
This is your evidence against the ladder?
Yeah, like I said, the way you said it made your next line's not going to be like, wow, I totally agree. It doesn't sound like.
If everyone is completely homogeneous and there's no interaction with skills and the other side, then I would agree. But that seems like I don't really want to stand on that.
No, for sure. No, I completely agree. Yeah, so just in like a very mechanical way, we could add in a lot more characteristics of the person when we run these regressions and pull back these things. But again, yes, I agree. That's my short answer. We shouldn't, like, I wouldn't take this to say that like job ladder models just don't exist in poor countries. I think that would be like way too far out on a ledge. But at least in like a very simple first pass, it seems like people on average from the higher part of the distribution, wage distribution, are moving to new firms more than.
But if you look at developed countries, no, if you look at what happens to careers conditional on education, you see a bit of that pattern too. Like the guys with college educations, they have careers in job.
Okay.
The guys that are high school dropouts, they move in and out of unemployment and they don't have much.
I see. That's a good point. Yeah, okay. Right. Yeah, okay. Yep. Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, for sure. Okay.
But then how is that consistent with the worst signaling?
It's not. No. So literally what we're trying to do is just say, like, here are some models. They sort of have different predictions about how you should think. I'm going to use the word good, but don't take that super seriously. Like, they have different predictions about how you should be interpreting churn. They're unrelated models, at least at a first pass, conditional on the caveats that were just brought up. They sort of tell you the same thing, which is it doesn't seem like churn is a good thing in these countries. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit related to the labeling. So I'm thinking this bad, basically I'm just thinking, so I should not think about it, no? Because I think about I have a assistant professor job and a McDonald's job, and the McDonald's will tell you, why don't you try it? And this is just, in relative terms, it's much more effective for me to let you try on the job than to do 6 interviews and let me tell you about the cooking experience that I have and blah blah blah. So for certain job types, it's just instead of going through a long interview process, you just say like try it. No? So,
yeah, it could. It could, yeah. I mean, this is the same thing that's come up with occupation quite a bit, right? It could just be that there's less cost to letting people try on jobs. Yeah, that's certainly right. Since I only have a few minutes, let me just talk about like occupations and such things, and then we can get back into a lot of this. All right, so just in the last few minutes, I'm just going to show you stuff about exit rates. But what we're after here is the relationship between GDP per capita and the exit rate. So I'm not going to be trying to like match the variance of every data point in these graphs. I'm just going to be trying to figure out something that accounts for the slope of, say, the linear best fit line or something. So think about the true exit rate in country C in year T as some weighted exit rate across groups G. So for example, if you wanted to consider gender, this would be the set. If you wanted to think about firm size bins, that would be the set. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to rewrite some counterfactual transition rates where we set the weights equal to just the data set average. Right? How you pick these averages is irrelevant, but just we're going to fix the weights. And then we're just going to ask, when we run these linear regressions of the true rate and these fixed weight exit rates on GDP per capita, how much closer do we get, how much closer do we get to 0, essentially? So we're just going to say, like, if we fix the weights, can we get rid of the relationship between GDP per capita and exit? Now, we're not going to tell you a story about why these things are the way they are across countries. We're just going to sort of point to them and say, look, here might be some things you would want to think about if you were going to take this model a little deeper. All right, so here's some worker characteristics. There are 84 total bins. And so you still get this negative relationship. And so all told, these worker characteristics account for something like 35%. They're just on their own. They account for about a third or so. When you break it down across the 3 different things we put in there, one of the interesting things is that age and gender don't seem to matter at all. If you were going to pull out anything from these worker characteristics that matter, it's education. Right, so age and gender, no action whatsoever. Education accounts for a little bit, and then some of it is from sort of the cross relationships between these things. Now, when we turn to the firm side, sectors don't seem to matter very much. Again, with the caveat, these are the number of bins we have. So let's see, there's 15 sectors, there's 11 occupations. There's not a lot of action on sectors. There's a little bit more on occupation. Informality seems to roughly get you in the same ballpark as occupation. The thing that matters a little bit more is this firm size distribution. We've binned it a couple different ways depending on, one of the problems is that firms or countries report different bins of firm size, so sometimes you have to drop some countries depending on how you do the binning themselves. But in our broadest categorization that lets us have the most countries, which is just less than 10 workers, more than 10 workers, it turns out you can get about half of this relationship just from there. So again, I don't have a theory of why that's true, but it does seem like firm size and maybe some of these other things with a lot of the caveats that have already been brought up, that in principle this number could be a lot bigger if we went narrower on occupations, are sort of the places to look for this relationship as opposed to, say, looking at age and gender differences. All right, so that's it. So just to wrap up very quickly, I think hopefully the benefit of this is that we put together this new data set. The aggregate facts are just that there's way more churn in poor countries. There does seem to be some role for firm size, occupations, and formality. And then at some point, we'll put all this online. We think there's a lot of other uses for this. So thinking about things like structural transformation, job polarization. And one thing we haven't spent any time yet thinking about is the business cycle properties of these things. So thinking about trade shocks, exchange rate shocks, things that might help you pin down, say, moments in an international model. And that's it. Thanks.
Great.